Hello and welcome to the Alpine Valley School podcast. I'm your host, Mark Gallivan, a former AVS student, a graduate, and a current staff member at the school. This is episode 24 of our show. Show notes are available for this episode at alpinevalleySchool.com/podcast/EP24. Today we are talking about Judicial Committee, which is one of the central bodies that helps govern the school. The way we define Judicial Committee is as follows. The Judicial Committee, or JC, investigates complaints of alleged law book violations written by school meeting members. Those charged may plead guilty and receive a sentence, or they may plead not guilty and take their case to trial. The JC maintains records of its investigations and submits a report for review at the next school meeting. In a sense, Judicial Committee is our version of a trial. There's a complainant, there's an alleged violator, and a jury of peers, in addition to someone who runs the meeting and keeps things going in an orderly fashion. The seriousness of cases that are brought before JC are often nowhere near as severe as a court case, but the outcomes are still very important to our school. Alpine Valley School has a law book that we all as school meeting members agree on to be part of the school. When one of the laws is broken, Judicial Committee is our way of dealing with that. The emphasis in Judicial Committee is also on being neutral parties who investigate something that unfolded without really any stake in the outcome. So if, for example, one of the people whose week it is to serve on Judicial Committee witnessed the case in question, they would be relieved of their duties for that case and would then be turned into a witness. Now, we're not going to go too much into the ins and outs of Judicial Committee in this episode. There are other resources that actually spell out exactly how JC works. And in fact, we also have a video of a mock JC that we recorded a couple of years ago that walks through a pretend case, but in the same way that we would in real life. So that's on our YouTube channel. I'll post a link to that in the show notes for this episode. I'm also going to post a link to a blog post called Law and Order Alpine Valley School, which has some more resources in it, but also, again, walks through what a traditional Judicial Committee session would look like. So all of that stuff is there in the show notes for you to check out if you want to know a little bit more about the actual procedures themselves, because what we're going to get into in this episode is a little bit more of the philosophy behind JC. So besides the actual procedures used by Judicial Committee, we're going to explore some deeper questions that include scenarios where it seems like the system is not working, where the same things are getting written up over and over again, and it feels like maybe nothing is changing. And for those challenges, I turned to three of our former judicial clerks, Xander Alford, Katy Cure, and Ellie Welshon. All three of them are Alpine Valley School graduates, and all three of them were JC clerks for multiple terms. In fact, between the three of them, I've calculated they have almost 5 years of experience as judicial clerks, which is pretty remarkable. In our interview, I set them loose on these tough questions and several more, and I think they came through in a big way. Here's our conversation. All right. I am here with Xander, Katy, and Ellie, and we're going to talk about Judicial Committee. Would you guys start by introducing yourselves? Ellie, I'll pick on you first.
Oh, good. So my name's Ellie, and I went to the school pretty much since I think I was like 6 months old when I started going with my dad, so pretty much my whole life. And I am working as a service writer at a place called Denver Spring and Suspension right now.
Nice. Katy?
I am Katy. I have gone to the school since 2011, and right now I'm a process server.
And Xander?
I went to the school from age 9 to 18, and I think I was JC clerk for like a year total over various terms. And right now I'm working as a microscope service technician.
Great. So talking about Judicial Committee, could you, how would you describe JC or the function of JC in the school in 1 or 2 sentences? If you had to tweet about it. What would you say? Katy, I'll pick on you.
I generally tell people it's just a smaller version of a court, and that's how we run the school.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
Yeah, I can't think of a better example than that. Just it's a simplified, streamlined justice system.
I was going to say pretty much the same thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Makes sense. So you guys were all here for multiple years. What was your impression, or like, what is your impression, I guess, in retrospect, when you look back on the time you spent in JC about kind of the role that played in your own experience at school?
Well, it started out for me as a scary thing that I didn't know how it worked. It was just a matter of time before I ended up there because I left out a lunchbox or something, so I was scared of it. And then I did leave out my lunchbox, and I did go to JC, and I did cry, and it was fine after that.
It happens.
I figured it out, and as the years went by, I got more comfortable with it, and I wanted to get involved with it, and in the end, I think it was probably the strongest influence in cultivating a personal sense of responsibility.
Wow. Katie, how about you?
Well, as soon as we toured the school, I knew I wanted to be involved in JC. I also knew that I did not want to sit on the other side for any reason whatsoever.
Like the written up side?
Yeah.
Okay.
I wanted nothing to do with that at all. But I eventually had to, and that was a rough time.
Did you cry?
I didn't.
Oh.
Maybe later. I don't remember.
I cried the first time I was in JC, and I was 14.
I don't think it would have mattered what.
Yeah, I was very upset. I remember that. Ellie, how about you? What do you think now that you can look back on your experience?
It was super similar to Xander's experience. The first time I went into JC, I've been told that I made my dad go in with me and hold my hand. So it was terrifying, I'm sure. As like a 12-year-old, I hated it. I still thought it was like, oh, I have to go to JC, and it was not so great. But as I got a little bit older and a little bit with a good head on my shoulders, I started to really like it, and I wanted to get involved with it. So served as JC clerk for a really long time. And now I see that it did play a huge part in who I became and a lot of the ways that I look at things out in the real world, and it was good.
Yeah. Oh, good. So everyone who's terrified of JC becomes the JC clerk. Is the extrapolation from there. So one of the questions that we get a lot, especially from people who are kind of just starting at the school and haven't had a lot of exposure to JC, is whether the focus of JC is on punishment or on like restorative justice. And what's your impression of that dynamic?
I'd say it's definitely restorative justice. I mean, I can't think of a single time where I gave a sentence that I was just like, oh yeah, this is going to be a good punishment. This is going to make their life hard. This is the thing to do. It was more like, there's a conflict or a problem. The two parties came together. There was testimony heard. A bunch of unbiased people took a look at it in the situation and came up with something that they felt would help to resolve the situation, at least that time or in the future, and to help, the person who got written up, hopefully to get better at not doing it, or to at least understand the consequences of it.
Yeah. Would you guys agree?
Yeah, I don't think they necessarily are mutually exclusive. There has to be some amount of punitive consequences if you break the law, but it's not focused on that. It's entirely about explicitly and implicitly making that person rethink what they've done and what they are going to do. And it's not just a sentence, it's a whole. Just being in JC, for me, having been to JC for a crime that I committed, regardless of what the sentence was punishment enough for me to be very thoughtful about whatever the problem was in the future. But, some people need a little bit more pushing, and that's fine, and it works. And sometimes there are weird cases and weird cycles, but eventually it works out. Yeah. I don't know of a single time it hasn't.
Katie, would you agree?
Yeah, and it's not like this panel decides your fate. There is input from the person, like what's going to fix this problem for the person who wrote you up, and also maybe stop you from doing it in the future.
Yeah, because a lot of the time it's not like the perpetrator is intentionally doing this, like they have malicious intent. Sometimes they forget. They don't think about it. And sometimes a sentence is exactly what they need to bring that to the forefront of their mind in their everyday life for a few days. I left out my lunchbox, and I think I had to keep all of my belongings just within arm's reach of me for a day or two. And, of course I left my stuff out again later, but, a few more times of that over the years, and I hardly left things out at all.
Yeah, and I think that the difference, too, is like punishment is sometimes the implication is like you are bad and we don't like you. But really what we're trying to say is this action doesn't meet the standards that we've all agreed on in whatever way, and we would like this behavior to change, right? Which I think is one of those dynamics that sometimes people coming from a different environment where like there's an authority figure that can punish you for any reason and does not have to articulate that reason can be like there's this unfocused sense of like, am I going to be in trouble? Or versus like, here's directly what you did, like the behavior that's wrong, why it's wrong, and here's what we would like you to do to correct it.
Yeah, and whatever the JC does is subject to appeal. So even if an unreasonable sentence is passed on you, you can do something about it. It's not just, this unchallengeable authority has changed the way my life is going to work for the next week or so, and I just have to deal with it. You can go to school meeting and have a discussion about it, and who knows, school meeting might be against you or with you, but there will be a discussion.
Okay, so you were all JC clerk for a significant period of time, and did you ever have a moment you can remember of frustration about thinking that JC wasn't working? That like you weren't seeing the change that you wanted in a particular individual or a particular scenario? Like, do you remember that feeling at all?
I vaguely remember it. I don't remember what the transgression was, who the person was, or what the situation was. It might have just been messes. I don't know, but it happens every now and then, and I knew that then, so I basically pushed it aside even in the moment, but it was occasionally frustrating, because, you have, typically you're on a team with a few people, and then every week it's the same thing, and like days have passed, and this is still happening. Why? But it's always a little bit different, and the person's attitude is always evolving in weird ways, and sometimes that's in a helpful way, sometimes it takes some detours on the way.
Yeah, I remember distinctly that we had one kid who was messing with people like on a daily basis.
Like bothering them, kind of?
Yeah. And so it would go to JC, and we would deal with it. We would give him a sentence, and then he would immediately appeal it and wait until the next school meeting, and then just break that sentence and continue on. And it just, and there was, we were doing all we could, but it still wasn't doing as much as we would have liked it to. And so we were trying to get him to stop it and figure out a sentence that was actually going to work and that was going to make him change his behavior. And that was just like the most frustrating time I've had in JC.
Yeah. What ended up happening?
I think the end of the school year, and he just kind of, when we picked back up in the fall, he was over that. Mm-hmm. He had moved on to something else.
Some developmental milestone had occurred.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So I remember having that experience both as being the one being written up and as a chairman. So it started as, when I was being written up for whatever I was doing stupid. I got frustrated because I felt like the meeting wasn't run how I would have liked it to be run. That happened for a while, so eventually I ran for JC clerk and decided if I didn't like it, then I would become involved with it and do what I could to change it. So I did that, and then as JC clerk, I saw a different side of it, and I was like, oh yeah, now there's this challenge. And then most of the time it was just phases kids would get in. They would do the same thing over and over again, and it was really just a matter of coming up with creative sentences and waiting. It was just a matter of, doing the same thing over and over again until eventually they realized what they were doing was maybe needing to be changed. But, some kids take a long time, and some kids would get it after one or two cases. It just depends on the kid.
So sometimes it's a waiting situation. Like, you just got to wait out whatever phase they're in.
Yes.
Right. And I'm assuming that doesn't necessarily apply to, like, violent crimes.
Right. That's like the messes or, like, the kids that run in the hallway all the time. Like, they're just so excited to get everywhere faster that they can't slow down. Those are the main things that I think were reoccurring.
What about noise cases? What do you remember about there being cases involving the level of noise?
I feel like there weren't actually that many when I was at school. Towards the end of my time, I remember a few. But when I was younger, I don't really remember actually that many cases of it.
Yeah,
I vaguely remember an interesting trial about it that I may or may not have been involved in. I can't remember. I might have been a prosecutor or something about a noise case.
Yeah, so I don't think there were very many noise cases for most of the time that I was there. But once we moved the computer room to where it is currently, right off the hallway of the main room, the computer room noises could now be heard from the main room. And so that's when the noise complaints started. And we had like a solid 3 months of just every day there are noise complaints from a small group of individuals. That was also frustrating.
Right, yeah, and the door wouldn't close or something too, right?
Yeah,
I remember that. Oh, great.
Yeah, so, I mean, did you feel like there was any progress in that? Like, I can see, if when the computer room was farther away, right, they could be noisier without necessarily... And the door closed all the way, fully, yeah. Mm-hmm. They could be noisier without disrupting anybody. And then when that shifted, there was an adjustment. But, like, it seems like that's a long adjustment. Did it feel like it got better at all before you graduated, or you just left and it was, like, still kind of unresolved?
Some of the kids kind of got the message after the first couple of cases, and there were very distinct lines. Everybody knew who was yelling and who wasn't, and but some of the kids just didn't get it.
Do you remember a time, and I'm thinking of the trial that you mentioned, but I don't know the details necessarily, of a case where there were differing opinions on the level of noise? Like someone didn't think they were being noisy, but someone else thought they were being noisy, which is really like subjective about any of the laws, right? Like what's running and what's not running. And we've had to define that very specifically over the years. What's acceptable level of physical contact inside the building versus outside the building, and like those kinds of things. How do you and JC like figure out how to interpret those laws that are more subjective?
I think it really is just a case by case basis. Like there is a law that says you can't be excessively noisy, and that if the people involved and witnesses and things decide that they were being excessively noisy, then that could be dealt with. But sometimes it just, seems noisy, but it's not.
So you're looking for more of a consensus?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What all the people involved
Sort of an implicit reasonable person concept.
Argument. Yeah, like would a reasonable person find this to be noisy?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't think I ever heard that term used, but that's essentially what people started to gravitate toward.
Do you remember any time that you felt like you had a real win in JC, like a success of either somebody changing their behavior or like a really good sentence?
I have some vague memories of Ellie talked about creative sentences earlier, and it reminded me that every once in a while you'd have a repeat offender. They've had the same sentence or a very similar sentence 3 or 4 times. Nothing has changed. It's been, months. Every week or 2 weeks there's the same case in a different room or whatever. And one day the JC members would come up with a creative sentence that would be easy to follow and reform their behavior much more effectively because it's just novel. And that when that worked just right off the bat and we hardly had another case out of that person, that was really satisfying. I'm sure it's happened at least 2 or 3 times because I remember that, savoring that feeling, but I can't remember the specifics.
I remember we would have a person who kept doing the same things over and over and over again, and I think it was running in the hallways, and we were just sitting in JC for an extremely long amount of time, just trying to figure out and trying to work with the person and see what is going to work. And we would just start throwing out crazy ideas for sentences, and something would stick. Like one time specifically, we were like, well, what if they had to crawl in the hallways? Well, you can't do that. That's not very nice. Well, what if we made them sit in every doorway? Well, yeah, that could work. That would be great. Yeah, let's do that. And from then on, that was like the go-to sentence for running in the hallways. It forces people to stop, but it's not inhumane. That was like the greatest day ever.
That's awesome.
Yeah, the ideal is easy to follow and effective. It's definitely not about making their life harder. The easier it is for them to remember it and then connect that with reforming their behavior, the better.
Yeah. And I think it's like mindfulness, right? Like that sentence is making you mindful of when you are entering a room by making you sit there or sit down. Or like some of the ones that I remember recently that have had a pretty good effect are like, if I'm harassing Ellie on a regular basis and I can't be in the same room as Ellie, and if Ellie comes in a room, then I have to leave. That makes me super mindful of my behavior around Ellie because I have to be aware of where Ellie is and I can't be in the same space with her for a while. And that like really, like it focuses you on like, this is the issue of what is going on here. And this is what you need to correct to not have this hassle. So what do you think that you learned by being JC clerk? And I think you guys touched on this a little bit in the beginning, but like some of the things that you learned as JC clerk that still apply to your life as adults.
So many things.
Yeah.
So many things. Like, I think a lot of the big ones for me are, especially, in the workplace, when I'm confronted with a situation, I don't just take what I've heard from one person and assume the situation and assume, that person's wrong. So-and-so said this person did that. Obviously, so-and-so's right. Instead of, taking a second to think about maybe I should hear both sides before I even come to a conclusion or think about who's right and who's wrong.
And it's not even making sure you hear both sides. It's knowing that even though there are only two sides, both of them could be a little bit wrong.
Right.
Even with both sides of the picture, you don't have the complete picture. You have to think about it a little bit more carefully. And I think something that will come in handy eventually is making an effort to be a reasonable, accountable authority. I don't have anyone working under me now because I'm 20, but I feel like in the future, whenever that is a part of my life, I'll be more equipped to be reasonable and effective in that position.
I think specifically from being the chair of JC, I got a real sense of like responsibility, and I like just knowing that you have to be on time and you have to get people in line on time and you have to make sure everything's running smoothly and make sure, you get everyone out of there on time. And I really got that from running JC.
Yeah, so like meeting management kind of. Yeah, that's applicable across many fields.
And when you spend every morning of your week expecting people to just give the simple truth, then you start to expect that of yourself in every situation, and it makes it a lot easier to just be automatically crystal clear and honest. I'd like to say I've always been an honest person, but kids aren't born honest. It's something that you develop, and it was really helpful to internalize that. Why be anything but honest? Why obfuscate things? Just get to the point. If you do something wrong, own up to it. Try to make it better. Do something.
Yeah. And it's not the end of the world, right?
Yeah.
Like we all thought it was.
Yeah, there are consequences, but they don't have to be dire.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I learned was that you can disagree with somebody and it doesn't mean that you don't like each other. Like when somebody wrote me up, I was like, oh my God, this person hates me. They don't want me to be here. They want me to go away. And like, I took it so personally the first few times until I realized that like, it wasn't that like Larry didn't like me. He just didn't like me leaving my lunch out or whatever it was that I did. And, that it wasn't a personal issue. It was like, these are the laws that we all agree on and you've got to adhere to that. And that made a big difference for me.
Mm-hmm. And when you are the accused and you're on the other side of the table and the whole JC is trying to deal with, like, you've been charged, you've pled guilty, and these people are trying to sentence you, you get used to the idea that even though they are imposing something on you and you don't necessarily like it, you can still be friends with them later.
Right.
It doesn't mean anything in particular. You can separate the two, rule of law and social norms. It's fine.
Yeah. And lately we've been really trying to be more collaborative on sentences. So like the person who gets charged, if they plead guilty, we're like, what do you think would be a good sentence? And frequently they say something that's either more difficult than what JC would have come up with, or that is like incredibly reasonable. And we're like, well, if you want to do that, great.
Yeah.
That's wonderful.
Yeah. Toward the end of my time as JC clerk, that was something that we were doing. I remember that. And it was really nice when we were like thinking, we could do something really harsh here. This is the 8th time, but how harsh can we really go? And then we ask them for input, and they say, how about I have to turn around 8 times in every doorway for the next month? Like, if you're willing, sure. Okay.
That's a little excessive.
If you're okay with that, that's fine. And then it works for them, and hallelujah, it's great. I mean, that's a ridiculous sentence. They would come up with something a little bit better if we accepted it. But sometimes it's a blend too. They'll come up with something, we might expand it, we might pull it back a little bit, and that collaboration makes them feel better about the sentence, and it makes it more likely for it to succeed, and it's just the ideal situation.
Well, thank you guys for sharing your expertise and your memories of Judicial Committee. I appreciate it. I want to highlight something that Xander, Katy, and Ellie all said in this interview, which is the phrase, I wanted to get involved. They had experienced Judicial Committee from the other side, and all of them wanted to get involved. I think that's one of the most unique aspects of this type of education, is that kids can and do get involved in real jobs with real responsibility. If the judicial clerk doesn't show up for school or forgets that it's time for JC, then JC doesn't happen. And that's an integral part of the school that traditionally students are responsible for. It's not make work. It's not something that we're making up like a model court system. These are real cases with real impact on people's lives. And there's immersion in an actual society where these roles are taken seriously. The same goes for school meeting positions, school meeting chairman, school meeting secretary, and other official positions throughout the school, all of which students are eligible to run for and hold. So I just wanted to highlight that because I do think that's something that we don't talk about very often on this show, but is a big part of life at school and is a real step up for a lot of young people to have that kind of responsibility. Thanks again to Xander, Ellie, and Katy. Ellie has been on the podcast before. You can listen to her episode by clicking on the link in the show notes. Thanks to Rivka Morgan Sherman, an AVS parent who sent in the idea for this episode and some of the questions that we used in the interview. If you want to get involved with the podcast, you can send an email to podcast@alpinevalley.school.com, or you can reach us on social media. We are Alpine Valley School on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. If you want to support AVS and the work we do here, please consider sharing this podcast with your family or friends that you think might be interested. We are making a concerted effort at expansion in the next school year, and we need all the help we can get in spreading the word. Sharing our social media pages and blog posts are also very helpful if you feel inclined. Again, you can find show notes for this episode at alpinevalleySchool.com/podcast/EP24 for episode 24. That's it for this episode. Thanks, as always, for listening. I'm Mark Gallivan. This is the Alpine Valley School podcast, and we'll be back again soon with more stories of real learning for real life.